I get to bed really early nowadays because I've got young children. And sometimes what happens is I wake up really early as well. So I got up at 3:30 and I just couldn't go back to sleep. And then I remembered, oh yeah, wasn't that debate was on? And it had just finished when I kind of switched on my phone. And yeah, they just finished, and I ended up watching the whole thing on double speed. And wow. So I watched it from the start, and I hadn't seen how it was spun because it was too early for any of that to see what headlines and people were saying on social media. But the first few minutes, you kind of had like Trump kind of like getting in little jabs at Kamala Harris. And it was like, oh, I don't like the look of this because everyone's expecting her to trounce her. But no, after that, from like 5 minutes in, she absolutely nailed it. I thought.
She took it
She really got under his skin. It was amazing.
Anyway, we're not a political podcast. We are a media podcast.
Oh.
Yeah. So what news stories mattered most this week in the world of media and advertising? I'm Jack Benjamin, reporter for The Media Leader.
Yes, I'm Omar Oakes, editor-in-chief of The Media Leader.
And we're back from our little summer hiatus, and this week we'll be discussing Paul Marshall's purchase of The Spectator, the dissolution of EssenceMediacomX, the latest report from Ofcom about TV viewership for news, and much more. We'll be trialing a slightly different format today because there's just so much news to catch up on from over the past few weeks, and we don't want you to miss a thing. So first, Omar, the big news we're tracking this week is yet another Google antitrust trial, the second this year. Whereas the first trial was about whether Google maintains a monopoly over search, a judge already found that it does. This trial is about its alleged ad tech monopoly. So a few key things to understand about this trial. Google has ownership of the main publisher ad server known as DoubleClick for publishers. It also owns the ad buying tools for advertisers through Google Ads and Display and Video 360. And it owns the marketplace itself where the ads are bought and sold, known as the Ad Exchange or AdX. And the DOJ is saying that through those ownerships, the ad tech ecosystem, it's abused the market to its own benefit. So Omar, we're a few days into the US trial. I'm curious what you think the main takeaways are so far.
Well, this is round two, I suppose. The US Department of Justice has argued that Google has followed the quote-unquote monopolist playbook through acquiring its way to success. It bought DoubleClick, as you say, and AdX back in 2007. Was it that long ago?
For more than YouTube, actually. It was cost more than YouTube.
Yeah. Well, it's more than paid for it, right? The DOJ also said that through tying Google Ads to AdX and AdX to Google Ads Manager and DoubleClick for publishers, Google was intentionally advantaging themselves. The government also compared the advantage to creating a silent auction where the auctioneer could open the envelope and offer to pay a penny more. And as you said, it's helpful to be buyer and seller and have the exchange as well. Right. So what have we heard so far at the time of recording? We've had witness testimony from Tim Wolf, who is a senior vice president at the largest US publisher, Gannett. Wolf said that of the $15 million they pay for in digital publishing tools, $10 million goes to Google, 2/3. He and other witnesses also said that it was extremely impractical for them to switch ad servers away from Google. Yesterday, we heard from another publishing consultant who said that out of the sort of 75 or 80 publishers that she's consulted for, only one didn't use DoubleClick for publishers. On the other hand, Google has argued that it's invested a huge amount of capital into its ad tech tools and that the overall market is actually intensely competitive. It downplayed its share of the two-sided market.
Yeah, and big quick shout out to Check My Ads, who has a reporter on the ground in the actual newsroom. We are obviously not personally there and are relying on coverage from other sources that are actually in the courtroom. But Omar, so lots going on with this trial. But what are the stakes? I mean, what's at risk here for Google? It seems like the prosecutors have a pretty solid case. I mean, every time I talk to anyone in ad tech privately, they'll say that, yeah, well, Google clearly has some sort of a monopoly over the ad tech ecosystem. This is going back years of conversations. I mean, why should people care about this sort of monopolistic practice? And could it go away through this through litigation?
Well, I think that's a good question because experience has taught us that, frankly, they shouldn't care. What I really worry about with this whole process, and you referenced the first trial, which concluded the end of last month, Google found guilty of antitrust in search. We're not going to hear about penalties about that until August next year, I think.
That's
summer.
right. That's right.
So it's a long time away. And what I really worry about here is what happens if Google loses this one again, and the remedies for case number 1 and case number 2 are essentially the equivalent of a speeding ticket. If someone's a bad driver and is a danger to other people on the road, you take them off the road, or you change the behavior somehow. You can give them a speed ticket, but that speed ticket has got to be so big that that person really thinks about whether they can continue driving a car. If Google truly is a monopoly and it's harming the digital ad market to the extent that the government alleges, it's $100 billion fine. That's a behavioral remedy, which, even though it's a large amount of money, it's not so large if you're Alphabet, the parent company of Google and YouTube, which has a market cap of $1.8 trillion. And if you look at Alphabet's share price over the last 5 years, you wouldn't know they had lost this case last month. You wouldn't know. It's like it's down 20% since late August at time of recording. But do you remember the digital ad slowdown 2022 as we all came out from COVID and we weren't on our phones as much as we were? That was, the share price was down by 33%. That was far more damaging to Google's ad business. So I remain skeptical about what's actually going to happen going forward.
It's worth noting, so not to be outdone by the Americans, the UK's Competition and Markets Authority last week released its own preliminary findings into Google's ad tech business. And they've provisionally found that Google has abused its dominant positions in open display ad tech as well, potentially harming thousands of UK publishers and advertisers, and similar, allegations potentially of preferencing their own services, etc. But it's worth noting in terms of punishment, the CMA can now impose a financial penalty on any business found to have infringed upon competition laws of up to 10% of annual global turnover, which that's probably pretty huge. Is that the type of fine amount, if there was going to be a fine that would actually start to change behavior? It's sort of similar to like back when Fox was sued over voting machines, right? And that clearly has changed their behavior because now they can't say that the election was rigged or whatever. And
but that's completely different because that was a defamation case,
right?
And it was interesting because defamation, it's pretty hard to win a defamation case if you're a plaintiff in the
certainly
US.
In the US,
which is why you have libel tourism and people come to the UK where we have much stronger defamation laws. That's a different story. But the key thing is that it's been really difficult for the US government, for regulators, for politicians to regulate tech in general, because these newer platforms, they're not new anymore, but the newer Google, Facebook, etc., they provide free services. And the whole mode of thinking about antitrust is it in artificially increasing prices? And this is why this current trial about the digital ad market, if they can actually demonstrate that their prices are higher as a result of Google's actions, that's going to be very interesting. But for consumers, these services are all free because these are different sorts of companies. They win through network effects and the advertising off the back of that. Look, all the evidence says that the US government, US legal system, US politicians, regulators, they're completely incapable of making the digital ad market more competitive by curbing Google's power. What would probably happen in practice is there's a big fine, it comes down in a year's time, and then there's an appeal a few months later, and then the fine is dramatically reduced. And guess what? In practice, Google gets to pay it in installments. So quarter by quarter, revenues don't change. And I go back to, I suspect the market looks at this and thinks, well, they shrug their shoulders and think, well, we've seen this all before.
Well, I appreciate your cynicism. I actually am more optimistic about this trial, including search as well, but especially the ad tech. It's just seems like such an obvious win. And I mean, the punishment might take a while, but I have to think a fine isn't the right remedy. You're going to have to force a breakup because you can't have someone that owns every part of the market.
Exactly.
So,
it needs a structural remedy, not a behavior.
And I think they know that. I mean, I think at this point, certainly the prosecutors know that. I'm sure they're going to make a strong case to the judge. And I mean, obviously, we'll have to just wait and see. Yeah. But I would think that in this case, you do see a structural change to the company, and that could include splitting off some of its businesses.
You're right. That's the key question that's behind all this. Would we all be better off if you just broke up Alphabet, broke up Google's business? Would the market actually benefit from there being more competitors? Or some argue, is there a natural monopoly element to a lot of this? Some like to compare Google search to the Yellow Pages in the past. What this trial really needs to find out for me is, has Google's behavior suggested that the payments, remember we heard a lot about in the last trial about the payments that made to Apple to default search, for example. Is it purely to shut out competitors? Are there other practices, as I get back to, can you actually demonstrate that prices are higher for advertisers buying ads for the agencies? Do we actually benefit from breaking up Google, or do we need to think more creatively about if there is a natural monopoly? You know, we might talk about the BBC later. The Culture Secretary Lisa Nandes talks about mutualization. Right? Do we need more creative business models for the digital economy to accept that you're going to have anti-competitive markets, but we can actually provide more value to consumers or to shareholders by a more creative corporate structure?
Well, we'll be keeping an eye on the trial. Certainly, it's expected to go for the next 4 weeks or so. And then, of course, who knows how long it will take to get a decision on potentially any punishment, assuming Google's found guilty of having a monopoly and abusing that power. So we'll be keeping an eye on it, and I'm sure talking about it more in the future. Apart from Google, there were a number of additional other stories that we wanted to cover today. We'll take them off one by one. Omar, why don't you kick us off? What else should people be aware of?
So it's finally happened. So in publishing news, Sir Paul Marshall has purchased The Spectator for £100 million. And he is also currently vying for The Telegraph. Jack, so what do you think Marshall's aim is in purchasing this August title, The Spectator?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's something to keep an eye on. He already has some part ownership of GB News and of Unheard, which is this other sort of magazine that likes to say that it's very centrist. And to be fair, I haven't read enough of Unheard to have an opinion. I don't know if you have an opinion on Unheard, but it's certainly different than The Spectator, which is known as a right-wing magazine. I mean, historically, it's always been associated sort of with the Tory party. He's sort of building a little media empire, a little conservative / centrist-ish, but mostly conservative, certainly through GB News media empire. And to me, that strikes me as an obvious ploy to start influencing, especially the Conservative Party here, on what he might want, whatever might be beneficial to him and his businesses. He's an ideologue to some degree. He's a very religious man. Not say that necessarily impacts his business decisions, but yeah, I mean, it's something to keep an eye on. I don't know if you have any further thoughts.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting, his backstory. I mean, he used to be a Liberal Democrat, and then somewhere along his journey became fascinated by Brexit, and it really captured his imagination. Obviously, GB News, we're all benefiting from that being in the marketplace now. I think it'd be really interesting to see what happens if he does purchase The Telegraph as well. The Telegraph actually growing quite nicely as a publication. It has a paywall, but it's a very cheap paywall. And, whatever you think about the politics of the content that they do, they have a very clear editorial line. And I think, we were talking earlier about the New York Times and what's going on in the US with the election and so-called sane washing Trump. I think news publications could, they do benefit from having a clear line. And who knows if it's the best long-term strategy, because maybe their readership is declining, but at least they have a really clear proposition. And clearly, if you can get synergies from these different entities, GB News, The Spectator and Telegraph, then, he could do very well against other right-wing competitors. I just think, I don't like to see The Spectator belittled by many as this kind of oddball right-wing magazine, which at its worst, I suppose it could be, when it does have a rich heritage as a publication of kind of being able to invite people with different views to argue against the grain. And Editors have always said, even Fraser Nelson, the current one, they've always said that, we invite people for more views. It just so happens that the vast majority of them happen to be right-wing libertarians. So I like the vibe of the Spectator, but I don't read it.
Right. Well, yeah. I suppose it's a bit like, Rupert Murdoch has multiple different publications and outlets that he owns, and they sort of, it's not the full spectrum, but you do have Wall Street Journal's pretty relatively respected right of center paper, and then also Fox News is much further to the right. So there's a strategy in having sort of covering a larger part of the ideological spectrum that he's probably going for. It's worth noting he's got deep pockets. Clearly doesn't care that GB News is not making money, or spending a lot of money to make sure that they get certain people on the program. And so sometimes the cost of doing business clearly doesn't matter to him yet. Sounds like he's willing to spend a lot to get the influence that he wants. In social media news, Kantar's latest media reactions report out last week received a great deal of attention from the mainstream press. It found that a net 26% of marketers plan to reduce their spend on X next year, and just 4% of marketers view X as a brand-safe platform. I was surprised it's even that high, but hey, you do have to take into account margin of error. I'm curious what you made of this. How screwed is X as a business? To put it bluntly.
Weren't we just talking about somebody purchasing a publication?
We were
that wasn't a media property that wasn't so interested in making money. Couldn't you put Elon Musk in the same category? Whereas we've talked so much about X and what's really going on here. And if you want to make money from advertising as a media business, then you have to appeal to a mainstream advertiser base. It's pretty simple, right? If you want to be niche publication, dare I say, do pornographic content, X in my view is a verbal pornography website now. It's not illegal. You can say that there's nothing wrong with it, but don't expect to attract a mainstream advertiser audience. So, and the brand safety is just an emblem of that. I think, looking at this report, there were other platforms where, wasn't it? I don't want to misrepresent, but there was another platform, was it a Google platform, maybe YouTube, where brand safety was only being seen as 36%?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, brand safety is a problem across the board.
I mean, so that 36% is not high.
No.
We haven't seen advertisers turning away in their droves, but balking at those sorts of figures. So it suggests that, there aren't alternatives. Maybe advertisers don't care that much because you price it in because of the nature of online publishing. So yes, it's another, it's the same old story with X, but we should, it's a wider problem in digital publishing.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Certainly there's a threshold that seemed to have been passed with X that hasn't been passed with other areas, but brand safety is a problem across the board, clearly.
In agency news, EssenceMediacomX is no more. The agency was folded into EssenceMediacom after the business lost its Sky Media account to Publicis. Jack, why has this occurred? And what is the fallout going to be for EssenceMediacomX staff?
This occurred after EssenceMediacomX did lose its Sky account. So worth noting, WPP, they merged Essence and Mediacom. And in the UK, the combined agency held accounts for both Sky Media at the time, as well as BT. And it also held things like Tesco's account and parts of Sainsbury's account. So the EssenceMediacomX was created just in the UK to handle some of those briefs to avoid conflicts of interest. So, in June, Sainsbury's announced that it had moved its digital account to Omnicom's agency, PhD. And then, you have this Sky Media account moving over to Publicis, a different competitor. So some of those conflicts has essentially just gone away. So the sort of reason for being for EssenceMediacomX has been reduced significantly. And so they've just sort of decided to shelve it. And in terms of staff, I've been told that EssenceMediacom is looking to retain a majority of staff from EssenceMediacomX. There is new leadership. Nat Cummins has been brought over. She's just at Zenith, left early this year. She's now going to be EssenceMediacom's CEO. We'll see how the team sort of settles in the coming weeks. In TV news, according to Ofcom, TV is no longer the single main source of news for UK adults, with 71% now accessing news online versus 70% for TV. The main driver for online growth is the increasing use of social media. 52% now use platforms such as Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram to access news, up from 47% last year. Is this at all surprising? I mean, this got a lot of attention, this report from Ofcom, but it seemed pretty inevitable that this would be coming at some point.
I mean, people do more than one thing. People get their news from online. They get the news from TV. They get the news from radio. They get the news from podcasts. And may even get a bit of news from what they're listening to right now. Digital is everywhere. It shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that most people are online most of the time. So I'm surprised that if you look at the Ofcom report, if you look at the main channels one by one, BBC One is still like number one, right?
That's right.
So it's a media fragmentation story that's actually affecting TV proportionately less than digital overall. So even though more people are using digital overall, they're using a much wider variety of digital media channels. Whereas, okay, over time, TV consumption is going down, but within TV, it's not fragmenting very much. You're still getting your main stuff from, even when you introduce Netflix and Disney, well, it's like, well, there aren't that many streaming platforms, and it's kind of aggregating behind the big ones. And it's the same thing for TV news. It's BBC, Sky, to an extent, ITV, maybe Channel 4 News as well. So it's actually showing not a lot of movement to, so a lot of breathless newspaper reporting headlines. They're always keen for something new, some new trend, some tipping point. But it's actually, well, things are actually quite stable.
Yeah. It's interesting, actually. You mentioned the streamers. None of them have gotten into news. I mean, the sort of competition is still, the old broadcasters are still doing live news. Now they've gotten into sports a lot, and that's something that we're tracking, but not yet anything to do with news. And I don't know why they don't want to touch it. Something to look into.
Because history's shown you can never make money from news.
Yeah. You can make influence, as we talked about already.
Well, yeah, it's always been an influence operation. Sky News has been fantastic, and Rupert Murdoch, when he created Sky, he very purposely said this is going to be an apolitical, it has to be to an extent because of Ofcom broadcasting rules, but this is going to be, a straight down the line centrist news service. And it's been brilliant for 30 plus years, but it's still been loss making that whole time. Still been loss making. That should tell you how difficult it is.
You mentioned we've talked about Rupert Murdoch quite a few times already on this podcast, but in succession news, News Corp activist investor Starboard Value submitted a non-binding proposal to end Murdoch family control of the company. Comes as a Nevada court case has begun hearing this week over the Murdoch family trust. Rupert is seeking to change the structure to give his son Lachlan full control of his media empire, but his other children are fighting back against that. Any chance the activist investor will succeed here? It seems like a lot of activist investors have been shot down recently in sort of entertainment conglomerates. Think about Disney and a few other ones.
Probably not. Let's be honest. Probably not. But it's interesting. It's always interesting when you have these activist investors involved. What the family will do to make them quietly go away. We've seen that with people like Nelson Peltz, am I pronouncing that right? In the past, famously, I mean, we were talking about X before. Remember what led to Elon Musk buying Twitter? There was activist revolt, which led to complete corporate restructure where they had to give 3 board seats away, and it diluted Jack Dorsey's influence over the company, and that paved the way for it to be a takeover target. So. I think maybe I'll change my answer to, if you kind of reframe your expectations of what success are, then perhaps it could be the start of something. But no, I don't think it's going to force his hand, if you like. In cinema news, August was the biggest month for the box office so far this year, earning over £120 million. Deadpool and Wolverine led the month with an additional nearly £30 million in revenue, followed by Ryan Reynolds' Mrs. Blake Lively's It Ends With Us at £19.4 million. So good month for the Reynolds and Lively's. Jack, is this a blip? Is this just big summer ever, or what do you think?
It's definitely not a blip. It's encouraging. It's the biggest month since actually Barbenheimer last. I think that was July. So yeah, it was a big month. Lots going on. It was a mix of course, school hadn't gone back to school yet. So you have lots of family-friendly films over the summer that were still making a lot of really good money. Inside Out 2, Despicable Me 4, this Deadpool and Wolverine movie. Maybe not exactly for kids, but I'm sure there were a lot of teens that were really loving this movie. Cinema box office still tracking well behind last year because Barbenheimer was just such a big thing and lasted all through the summer. So they're really counting on Q4 this year to hopefully deliver a bit more money, a bit more attendance. But I would be a little surprised if it lives up to the tough comparable from last year. We'll see. That new Joker movie is coming out soon. That's going to do super well among 16 to 34s. Gladiator 2 might also do well in that sort of segment, maybe older, especially older male audiences. What's interesting about It Ends With Us is that I don't think it's expected to do very well. And it has, and I think it reveals a bit of a underserved consumer segment among especially adult women that want more romantic films or romantic dramas, romantic comedies, and there's just not quite enough of those. And I'm sure advertisers would love to advertise against those types of films, actually, in particular. But we're still not that far off from the writer's strike, from the pandemic. It takes a while to produce all these different films. So hopefully we see a bit more of a diverse slate going forward, especially the next year. Finally, in out-of-home news, Transport for London has reappointed Global and JCDecaux for its underground and bus shelter advertising contracts, respectively. Omar, quickly, how important is the TfL account for these out-of-home companies?
It's really important. It may not seem that exciting that it's just gone back to the same outdoor companies it was using before for these contracts, but it's a huge UK account. It would have been big news if either one had lost it. The company we haven't talked about, because they didn't win either, is Clear Channel. Remember, in the background, Clear Channel is trying to sell its business outside of the US, but it apparently can't get the price it wants to get for that international business, so it hasn't sold it to anyone. And not winning contracts like this are not going to help. The big story is what's going to happen next with Clear Channel. But yeah, it's obviously good news for Global and JCDecaux.
Well, I think that's all we have time for. I feel like we talked about damn near everything. Always a pleasure speaking with you, Omar, and thanks for listening. We'll catch you all next week.
Thanks. Bye. Thank you for listening to the Media Leader podcast. You can find and listen to all our episodes on our website at themedialeader.co.uk or wherever you get your podcasts. But just remember, please do subscribe to be notified when we release our next episode. From all of us at the Media Leader, I'm editor Omar Oakes. Our executive producer is Jack Benjamin. See you next time.